Welcome back. I'm talking to Andrew Johnson about Mars and the possibility of life on Mars. Now, in the 1970s, NASA sent two probes, the Viking probes, which were sent, one of its missions was to specifically look for microbial life. 3 experiments. Just tell us about that, Andrew.
Yes, well, there was basically, the main experiment was to send out a robot arm from the probe with like a little scoop on it, or a spade or a shovel, whatever you want to call it, dug into the soil, and it would bring a sample of soil into the probe. It had like a chemical laboratory, a small chemical laboratory inside the probe, and they would pour like a sugary solution, but the sugary solution had radioactive carbon in it. And then if there were any bacteria, they would then feed on this sugary solution, and they would digest or process the carbon, and then they would give off carbon dioxide, and so you'd be able to detect the carbon-14, the radioactive carbon, in the gases given off. And that's indeed what happened, and they found that this gas, carbon dioxide, was given off with radioactive carbon in it, so it had been metabolized. The sugary solution had been metabolized.
So that went on, gave off CO2 for 3 days.
Correct.
Which was proof of life.
Essentially, it was proof of a life process, because if it was an ordinary chemical reaction, it wouldn't have, it would have just been over in half an hour or an hour or something like that.
Then there was a second experiment which also proved life.
Right, that was, I think, called the pyrolytic release, and then there was a third experiment. It might be better if we play some of the clip.
We'll take a look at this clip
all of that.
Of what's the chap's name?
David Darling and Ron Bennett.
Right, explaining those 3 experiments and what NASA did with that information.
I believe that Viking found life, and I think that maybe not intentionally, but scientists painted the wrong picture of what happened. The message was put out that Viking found nothing more than unusual active chemicals in the soil, that basically Mars was dead. And that's had a profound effect on everything that's followed, including the direction of the whole space program. So the question is, where did things go wrong? Well, back in '76, 2 identical spacecraft, Viking 1 and 2, landed on Mars. They both carried miniature biology labs, kind of about the size of a microwave oven. It was quite small, but they had 3 experiments which were looking directly for life on Mars, and they were the first spacecraft to do this, and incredibly, the only spacecraft that have ever looked for life on another planet. In the 30-odd years since then, we've never sent out another probe to look for life, and that's because the mainstream science said Viking didn't find anything. So, they carried out some experiments. I just want to zero in a couple of them. One was called the label release experiment. One was called the pyrolytic release. And the agreement was beforehand, if any of these experiments found a positive signal, then we would say that they'd found life on Mars, and that was thrown out the window later on. So what the label release experiment did was it took a sample of Martian soil, it dripped some water onto it, some goodies, some nutrients, kind of like a chicken soup type of thing for bacteria. And the neat thing was that those nutrients were laced with radioactive carbon. And the hope was that any bugs in the soil would metabolize that food, and they'd give off radioactive carbon dioxide, which you could then pick up with a radiation detector, a Geiger counter. And lo and behold, that's exactly what it found, a big rush of radioactive carbon dioxide, which lasted for about 3 days. Exactly what you'd expect if there were bacteria in the soil, and not what you'd expect if there was a chemical reaction. It wouldn't last that long. There's no way. The other experiment, the pyrolytic release experiment, showed that organic chemicals were manufactured in the soil by something. That's kind of hard to explain without life going on. And these 2 together gave life signals. So why didn't scientists say that Viking had found life? Because according to the pre-agreed criteria before Viking ever left the launch pad, both of those experiments found life. The reason was there was another instrument on board Viking, which was called the GCMS. That stands for Gas Chromatograph Mass Spectrometer. And the whole purpose of that instrument was to look for organics, organic material, anything containing carbon, basically, in the Martian soil. And that came up negative. It didn't find a single thing. It didn't find a single carbon-containing molecule in the soil. And it was used as a court of appeal, basically. So you've got two experiments saying, yeah, there's life here by pre-agreed criteria. Another instrument says there can't be life, no organics, you can't have life. But that instrument wasn't working properly. And we know it wasn't working properly. It's been demonstrated. It was demonstrated even before Viking took off, although it wasn't really well known or advertised. But in several studies since then, identical equipment to the GCMS been tested on Antarctic soils, on soils from deserts regions on Earth, which are similar to Mars, and it has failed to find life where we know there is life by other instruments. And so this Court of Appeal instrument was faulty. We know it couldn't have detected organic material on Mars, and yet that's the way it panned out, that scientists used that as a way to say there's no life on Mars. So the GCMS found nothing, and so what did the Viking scientists team do? They dismissed the positive readings of the other two experiments. And they said that the activity in the soil was due to some kind of reactive chemical like hydrogen peroxide, and that was that.
Okay, Andrew. Well, that smacks of a cover-up to me.
Yeah, and I mean Gilbert Levin. I mean he's been very much an outspoken critic because Gilbert Levin was the scientist who designed the experiment we described before the clip, the labeled release experiment, and he actually was a bit amazed because they set out to debunk his experiment. In other words, they'd employed him to design this experiment and build it. And after it had given this result, they then tried to, NASA separately did, or scientists wanted to do 50 reproductions of Levin's experiment and claim that the effect was a result of oxidation, in other words, an ordinary chemical reaction with no life process involved. And they did 50 different experiments, but Levin argues that none of them completely explained the results that he got.
Right.
And one of the other things I should add on to that, in July 2004, Professor Vittorio Formisano, who worked for ESA, he did a spectroscopy experiment from Mars Express, which was the European Martian orbiter, and he was looking at the light which was coming back from the atmosphere of Mars, measuring the light and elements of the light in what's called a spectroscope, and he basically discovered biomarker gases, as they call them, in other words evidence of life in the Martian atmosphere. And he said, my observation should not be taken as a statement that there is life on Mars today, because we need to go there to drill the soil, take samples and analyse them before possibly concluding that life is there. Now, so he's talking about going there and drilling the soil to find life. Well, this is rather odd, because he said this in February 2005, and yet in 1976 the Viking probe had been to Mars and drilled the soil and detected life with a labelled release experiment. So we have two completely independent, separate experiments giving essentially the same result, yet they're not tying these together. The scientists are not, he didn't say, oh yeah, well this is what Viking discovered, so I think I'm right.
Just to be clear on this, Andrew, NASA's current position on life on Mars is there's none.
Yeah, they're
not even microbial.
Correct. They will basically say, well, we're still looking at the data.
Right.
We think we don't have any definite evidence that there is life on Mars. We still think there might be, but we're not really sure. That's essentially their position.
Have they admitted to water on Mars at this point in time?
Yes, they've announced that several times.
Right.
We have another picture which we can show, and this is a Viking image from 1979, and it says, this is their caption from the NASA website, and it says, this colour image shows a thin layer of water ice frost on the Martian surface at Utopia Planitia. Okay, so it's not liquid water they're talking about there, but they're saying water ice frost.
Right.
So that's water, isn't it?
Yeah.
And of course that's what the image should look like, because that's when the colour of the sky has been processed correctly.
So this is decades before they've admitted there's water on Mars.
Right. And I've heard them announce it several times. They announced it in 2006, and now they've been talking about it again with some of the Curiosity images.
And you mentioned the colours. Since well, they've been messing with the colours coming back from these exploration vehicles, mainly messing with the sky.
Mainly, yeah. I mean, they seem to, occasionally you'll get the odd picture which doesn't show a predominantly red or pink sky. Occasionally they'll show a sort of grey coloured sky or a sort of lighter coloured sky, but the correct colour of the sky is blue on Mars, as I understand it. And also Gilbert Levin has done his own analysis, and he concludes the same. Gilbert Levin, who did the labelled release experiment, also concludes, and I know that Anthony Beckett has spoken on this programme about this, probably, you know, so people can go back to that if they wish.
All right, now there's another chap called Charles Schultz III, who is from Carolina, and he's downloaded thousands of images from NASA of Mars looking at fossils.
Correct. I mean, he's been looking at some of the Spirit and Opportunity, which are two of the rovers which landed on Mars in 2004, and I think one of them is still working 9 years later. It had a lifetime of about 6 months or something, but it's still going. And yes, you're right, he downloaded lots of images from there, and he studied them in detail in sort of with very close eye. And he was recently featured on a news broadcast, well, I say recently, it was about 2011, just going through his findings with a local news reporter to find out, you know, to show the news reporter what was on these images. And it does appear he's found fossils of trilobites, or trilobites some people call them, and types of shells, and I agree with him. You can clearly see this. And Schultz was actually invited to present this research at a conference that NASA organised, and then he was you know, he bounced. He was uninvited from the conference the week before he was scheduled to go.
Right. So NASA haven't had their own biologists looking at these images to try and find fossils then, presumably, or they've not put out any information
Correct.
at all.
There's no official recognition of fossils on Mars,
Right.
as my understanding. Right. So, but if you look at Charles Schultz's research, to me it seems pretty clear what he's found.
Right. Let's take a look at this.
Well, last month, a NASA scientist in Alabama stunned the world when he said he discovered evidence of alien life. His claim was based on fossil remains he supposedly found in a meteorite. The next day, however, NASA said their researchers' work was flawed and unreliable. However, claims of alien life and fossils are nothing new for NASA. For the past 7 years, they've been dealing with the Winsboro man and his research. And his work may very well change our way of thinking forever.
Ever since the Viking probe landed on Mars in 1976, NASA has been trying to find out if life once existed or if it still exists there today. 30 years later, in December of 2006,
today you will hear what many are saying may be the most significant discoveries to date.
NASA scientists released photographs that suggest there is life, pictures that show water on Mars.
We can honestly talk about liquid water on the surface of Mars today.
The news was reported in the national media and was hailed as a major discovery. The only problem, another man says he made the very same discovery nearly 3 years earlier.
You came to the conclusion that there was water and life on Mars when?
The date when I was first certain of it was February 15th, 2004.
Charles Schultz looks and sounds like a modern-day Einstein. Using the Freedom of Information Act, he obtained more than 200,000 Mars images from NASA. And after thousands of hours of research, he came to some startling conclusions.
Many of the things that I've seen look very clearly like the recent erosion or presence of water, liquid water on the surface, and many of the images show what appear to be fossil organisms, marine fossils.
Right, fossils on Mars, and not just a few. Schultz says the planet is littered with them.
Right now, the planet has extremely thin air, very tough living conditions, but it is wet on the surface in many areas, and it is covered with fossil remains from marine organisms. Some of the fossils we found are seashells, and very clearly they are identical to the things we'd find on the Earth. This is a conch shell, apparently, found on the planet Mars, and this is one on the Earth. And you can see there's an absolute identical appearance to both of them.
Schultz showed me picture after picture. This is a trilobite fossil. All NASA images. Opportunity, the rover found on the 158th day of its imaging. And all of them compelling.
This clearly looks like water flow to me and mud.
It is.
The rover, the Opportunity, these Mars crafts that have gone up there and literally have gotten stuck in the mud?
In many cases, yes. Schultz's research has the potential to change the way we think about the universe. He's written numerous articles for scientific magazines and books on the subject. The latest is A Fossil Hunter's Guide to Mars. In it, he carefully lays out his research and conclusions.
NASA explained your findings.
Actually, they've ignored it. In the beginning, when I began posting a lot of my information and sending it to them as well, there was some interest, and my website had hits from 40 to 90% from Mars researchers, NASA particularly, and other agencies. But over time, the died off and there was no response. So they actually pretty much ignored what I posted. NASA Director Charlie Bolden won't speculate on the potential for water or fossils on Mars, but he's hoping the next rover mission, Curiosity, will answer those questions once and for all. It takes off this November. The first data is expected by the fall of next year.
We expect to make discoveries with Curiosity. I don't want to, set great expectations. What we find will be different from what we found before. It will look at the soil of Mars. It's looking for any signs of microbes or microbial life there. It's absolutely incredible what it's going to do.
And when I pressed him on Schultz's claims of fossils on Mars,
I don't know. I wish I could say yes, I do, but I don't know. I really don't.
Bolden referred me to a NASA scientist who's been working on the very same subject.
This activity, especially the fact that it's going on today, to me says that the mid-latitudes of Mars are one of the more remarkable places in the solar system.
Phil Christensen is well known for his work on Mars. Remember that December '06 announcement of water on Mars? Well, Christensen was there, and NASA's conclusions were supported by his research.
NASA's goal, long-term goal, is to land on Mars, collect rocks, and bring them back to Earth so that we can examine them in laboratories here under microscopes and look for any evidence of fossils or any other evidence of ancient life on Mars. I'm very confident that that rover will make discoveries that will really change our thinking. Again, every time we look, we find an interesting place. There were clearly environments on Mars billions of years ago that were very much like the Earth. And, it's very possible that life may have started there. Again, that would be a fantastic discovery, and that could be coming in the next year or so.
I think that they have been ready with this for a very long time. The first researchers on the mirror teams, the rover teams, included an oceanographer, a marine biologist who was looking at the images. And that's very telling in its own right.
Schultz believes disclosure will happen next year once the rover sends images back to Earth. It's something he says could have happened sooner, but didn't because of religious beliefs.
Many people allow their beliefs to dominate regardless of the facts. And it's not a stab at religion. This is just a presentation of the facts. People who have faith find a way to live with the facts.
You're dealing with science.
That's absolutely correct. You have to work with science and facts.
Is there life on Mars right now?
I do believe so, because nothing we know of would have sterilized the entire planet. Funguses, spores, bacteria could very easily still be in the soil today.
Well, despite his research, Schultz says he's not the person who first discovered life on Mars. He said that honor belongs to Viking mission scientist and current Arizona State University professor, Dr. Gary Levin. Levin believes he discovered microbial life from the soil samples taken from the 2 Viking missions from the 1970s. But NASA has never embraced those findings. Well, a huge announcement from NASA today. Their scientists believe water is flowing on the surface of Mars, and it's believed to be salt water, which could still theoretically sustain life. NASA says striking new images from the mountains of Mars may be their best evidence yet of flowing liquid water. Those images appear to show some sort of water flow on the Mars surface. Now, if true, NASA says this has profound implications in the search for extraterrestrial life. But today's NASA announcement is nothing new for a Winnsboro man. Charles Schultz has been studying the so-called red planet for years, and back in April, he told News 19 viewers that there's microbial life and water on Mars. He believes NASA has known this for years and is releasing the information a little at a time.
Little by little, the information is being given to the public to sort of prepare them for what's to come. The flow of water and the creation of mud is very common on the planet Mars, even today. And this mud flow is terraced. It's in layers, just as you'd expect in any place where the water's flowed. You can see how it's moved around here. And this is actually the geyser that probably was the source of that water. For 45 years, we believed Mars to be as dry as the moon, and yet constantly we're given information that tells us that's not so. It's loaded with water and mineral resources. It's another planet just like the Earth.
If you remember our story back in April, Charles tried to give NASA his findings, and they basically wouldn't listen to him.